Hey, welcome back. Today we'll be looking at Paradiso, Cantos 8 and 9, which is when Dante is on the planet Venus. Canto 7 concluded Dante's conversation with Beatrice, in which she is explaining to him some complex theological ideas, and Canto 8 opens with a discussion of the planet Venus. In this discussion, Dante talks about different ideas about love, misconceptions of love. He starts with the Roman goddess Venus, and her family, her mother Dione, and her son Cupid. And he reflects on the incorrect ideas of love conveyed by this goddess, and ultimately associated with the planet Venus. And as we've looked at these first three planets, we've noticed deficiencies in each of the souls there. In the first, on the moon, we notice a deficiency in faithfulness. On Mercury, we notice a deficiency in hope, and here we're going to see deficient love. These are souls who loved too much in the more carnal kind of ways in their lives, but now have been transformed by divine love. This is the last place that we're going to see deficient souls, because next is the sun, and beyond that is perfection. He describes the planet Venus as being the star that is wooed by the sun, now at her nape, now at her brow, pointing out that Venus can be a star of morning as well as a star of evening, in that she is seen sometimes in the morning sky and sometimes in the evening sky. And once again, Dante didn't even feel their floating up here because it was so quick, but he only recognizes it because of Beatrice's increased beauty. We notice that each time they get closer to God, Beatrice becomes more bright and more beautiful, as do all the other souls. And then he has this lovely metaphor for the souls that he sees here on Venus. And we've noticed that the souls are becoming harder and harder to see because they glow more and more brightly the closer we get to God. He describes seeing the souls as one sees a spark within a flame, or hears within a song a second voice, holding its note while the other comes and goes. So I saw within that light still other lights, swifter and slower in their circling motions, it seemed in measure to their inner sight. So there are lights inside of the light that he sees all around him, and those lights are the souls that he's about to visit with. And they come dancing towards him and singing. We have that continued idea of singing over and over again. But they pause in their dance and their song in order to talk to Dante, and they say, "All of us desire to bring you pleasure, so that you may in turn delight us." And a moment later, "We are filled with love, but to give you pleasure, a little respite will be no less sweet to us." There's a sweetness in the dance and the song of praising God, but there's also a sweetness in offering something up to Dante. And Dante turns to Beatrice to check for permission to make sure that he should be speaking to these souls, and she affirms it, and so he begins to speak to them. There's been a lot of great notes about one of Dante's other works called the Convivio, in which he discusses the role of the planets. He also discusses the importance of philosophy. And in that book, he actually put Beatrice aside and said, "I'm going to choose a greater lady, that lady of philosophy." That was part of the reason why Beatrice was so angry at him in Purgatorio. And there are moments throughout Paradiso that he corrects his previous ideas from the Convivio. Here he corrects some of his ideas about the ranks of angels and where they are positioned. And some of that is his deference, again, to Beatrice, recognizing that philosophy, although he's a very philosophical kind of person, is not as important as his deference to divine love. And that spiritual love he feels for Beatrice, which informs his idea of what love should be, should take primacy in his life. There's some fantastic notes about that in Hollander, who has got the best notes for Dante. As he turns to the first glowing soul there and asks who that person is, the soul begins to glow even brighter. I watched the light grow larger and more luminescent as I spoke, with new joy added to its joys. This is Charles Martel, who is someone who would have supported Dante a lot more had he continued to live. At least Dante thinks so. Also, he's what Dante sees as an ideal ruler, a king who would have supported Henry VII, and who would have done great things for the area he ruled over. Unfortunately, he died too young. And his death led to problems because not only was he no longer able to rule, but also his brother, Robert, began to rule. And Robert really wasn't cut out to be a king in Dante's estimation. Charles Martel's love for Dante and the love that he would have shown in supporting that poet, that good friendship kind of love, is what's really expressed here. We're going to get into the more problematic ideas of love in the next canto. But Charles Martel goes on to talk about the kingdom that he previously ruled over and how it's been inflicted with all of these problems, particularly because of his brother Robert's greed. His stingy nature, though he came from worthy stock, would require officials who do not set their hearts on filling up their coffers. And Dante, in listening to this, has a question for Charles. You have made me glad, now bring me light. For, listening to your words, I am confused. How from sweet seed may come a bitter fruit? So Dante wants to know how a good parent can create a poor and unfortunate child. How come from my gene pool comes bad kids? We've already seen in the past that Dante explores the idea that parents and children really follow their own paths. If you remember in the Inferno, we had Guido da Montefeltro, and then in Purgatorio, we had Buonconte da Montefeltro. A father and a son whose stories mirrored each other, and yet one was eternally condemned and the other was bound for heaven. Dante's going to explore that idea here again, and Charles Martel is going to give him an explanation for why that happens. And he's going to do that in a very Socratic kind of argument. He's going to lay out a proof for Dante that Dante will then sit there and nod and listen to, much like Socrates' students often did. If I can prove a truth to you, then you will have before your eyes an answer to the question on which you turn your back. And he goes on to explain how God created the universe good, and how God uses the stars to help push people towards fate. That might cause us to think, well, that I'm not responsible for my actions. But it's not that your actions are predetermined, it's that your inclinations are predetermined. Your talents perhaps are predetermined. Not only are the natures of the souls foreseen within the mind that in itself is perfect, but along with their natures, their well-being. And thus, whatsoever this bow shoots falls predisposed to a determined end, as a shaft directed to its target. So, your nature is inborn, and what would be best for you is inborn. If heaven didn't give you that kind of direction, then heaven would be chaotic, and God cannot be chaotic because that would be wrong. Dante goes, okay, I get that, and Charles Martel continues. Would it be worse for man on earth if he were not a social being? In other words, shouldn't society be made up of different kinds of people that all work together, doing their own part? Thus, one is born Solon, another Xerxes, one Melchizedek, another one the man who flew up through the air and lost his son. So each person is born with his own set of talents, and he's referencing a great warrior king, he's referencing this great priest, he's referencing this great inventor. It's interesting that he notes Daedalus as the man who flew up through the air and lost his son, noticing that Icarus was the failure in the family. Again, drawing that distinction of fathers and sons don't always end up in the same fate. But God determines, through the stars, each of us to have our own personality, our own set of strengths. Circling nature, which sets its seal on mortal wax, plies its craft with skill, but does not distinguish one house from another. So each of us have our own nature. But where does the problem come from? Charles Martel explains. Always, if nature meets a fate unsuited to it, like any kind of seed out of its native soil, it comes to a bad end. And if the world below paid more attention to the foundation nature lays and built on that, it would be peopled well. But no, you force into religion one born to wear the sword, and make a king of one more fit for sermons, so that your path departs from the true way. Hey parents, watch how you parent your kids. Make sure that you pay attention to what your child is interested in, what your child is good at. Don't try to make them fit a mold that doesn't work for them, because that's where things go wrong. You try to take someone whose nature is a certain way and cram them into a different box, things just come out badly. And in those last lines, we see the sense that Dante's kind of pointing out there. Charles Martel's two brothers. One was more fit to be a priest, and the other was more fit to be a king, and they swapped roles. So Robert was doing a terrible job as a king, and he probably would have been a decent theologian. So tragedy comes from a failure to accept ourselves the way God made us, and to accept our children the way they've been destined to be. Canto 9 begins right after Charles finishes speaking, and Dante says to Clemenza, who might be Charles's wife, or might be his daughter, we're not sure, that he knows that in the future things will go better for Charles Martel's family. In fact, he says that Charles Martel told me a little bit more about the future and about what would happen to his family, but I can't tell you right now. Be silent and let the years roll by. And so I can reveal no more than this. Fitting grief shall find the ones who do your family wrong. And then some more souls walk up, and Dante turns to them. Now another of those splendors moved in my direction, while its brightened glow proclaimed its wish to bring me joy. The eyes of Beatrice, fixed on me, as they had been before, held loving reassurance of her glad consent to my desire. Dante asks who this soul is, and the text says, "At that, their radiance, as yet unknown to me, out of the very depth from which it sang before, responded as does someone who delights in doing good." There's a joy that comes from reflecting on God, and there's also a joy that comes from sharing with Dante what he wants to know, as we saw in the last canto. And this soul is Cunizza, who was known for having lots of affairs, lots of husbands, lots of problems with love. And yet here she is in heaven. And there's the sense, the idea that she had embraced sensual love and sexual pleasure in her life, but ultimately had turned from that and sought divine love at the end. And that helps us to define the planet Venus as a place where people have moved into understanding love. And she speaks at length about her brother, Esilino, who we saw back in hell. And again, we get that difference within a family, how one member of a family can go one direction and another can go another direction, based upon how your life plays out. And Cunizza makes several prophecies about the bad things that are going to happen in Italy, in part because of her brother and her family. She concludes, and then Dante turns to the next soul, whose name is Folco, who also in his life pursued sensual and sexual pleasure, and then ultimately turned to divine love. He compares himself to Dido. And yet at the end of this, he says, "Yet here we don't repent, but smile instead, not at our fault, which comes not back to mind, but for that power which ordered and foresaw. Here we contemplate the craft that beautifies such love, and here discern the good from which the world above informs the one below." So they're able to be happy because their sins, the weight of those sexual pleasures, which were the wrong kind of love, have ultimately been purged. And you'd think that their past mistakes would grieve them, but because they've reached the divine, they've reached heaven, they no longer feel those. Remember how they drank from Lethe and had those memories washed away? And now they can see God's full plan, and how his divine love was ultimately right, and how everything was ordered and foreseen as it should be. And from this perspective, they understand love fully. Folco then introduces Rahab, who we know from the Bible as the harlot who helped the spies of Jericho, and ultimately helped Joshua and the Israelites to enter into the promised land. She has been taken up here at the moment that Christ went down into hell and had the harrowing of hell back in Inferno. And so again, all three of these souls emphasize the idea of moving away from that incorrect, excessive kind of love and moving into a divine love, and how a divine love shifts your perspective on things. And Folco concludes the canto wishing that the leaders of the church were loving the right things as well, and having the right perspective about the idea of the promised land. They have, after all, even abandoned the Holy Land for their own greed. And that brings us to the end of Venus. Next time we're going to be rising up to the sun, where things begin to get even more beautiful and more perfect. Thanks for watching. You can click to watch one of the other videos of Paradiso or of Inferno or Purgatorio. And I'll see you next time as we rise to the sun. Ah.